The night Sandra Martin's BMW got hit by a driver who never stopped. She was the most famous woman in that intersection, and not a single person in the crowd of onlookers moved an inch to help her. Phones went up. Flashlights came on. Someone even laughed nervously. But it was a man nobody recognized, a man who smelled like a 12-hour warehouse shift and wore a jacket with broken zipper, who walked straight to the smoke and the shattered glass, pulled her door open with his bare hands, and dragged her out just before the engine caught fire. He didn't take a photo. He didn't give his name. He just looked at her once, long enough to make sure she was breathing, and then he disappeared into the rain like he had somewhere else to be. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel, and it proves that powerful stories resonate everywhere. It was 11:47 on a Thursday night when Sandra Martin made the last turn she would ever make without thinking twice about it. She had just come from a Callaway Foundation gala, a black tie affair held every year at the Heartwarming Museum, where the chandeliers were the size of small cars and the wine cost more per bottle than most people made in a week. Sandra had worn a white Valentino gown, a diamond necklace her father had commissioned for her 25th birthday, and a kind of practiced smile that comes from a lifetime of being looked at. She'd spent the evening shaking hands, accepting compliments, being photographed next to people whose names she would forget by morning. Her BMW was one of 3 she owned. This one was navy blue, loaded with every comfort feature available, and it sat low to the ground the way expensive things always do, like they're trying not to be noticed while being impossible to ignore. The leather seats were heated. The sound system was on. She was listening to a playlist she'd made at 17 and never updated. The light at Meridian and 6 turned green, and Sandra pressed the accelerator. She never saw the other car. It came from the left, from a cross street that was supposed to have a red light, but apparently that hadn't mattered to whoever was driving it. The impact was on the driver's side, a full-force collision that spun the BMW sideways and sent it up over the curb. The car hit a metal signpost and stopped hard, the front crumpling inward like wet cardboard. The airbags went off. The windshield cracked in a long diagonal line. Sandra's head snapped to the right and then back, and for about 3 seconds she wasn't sure what direction was up. Then the ringing in her ears started, and she was sure she was alive. She tried to push the deflating airbag away from her face. Her left wrist screamed when she put weight on it. The door on her side was folded in slightly, not enough to trap her completely, but enough to make it clear it wasn't opening with a simple pull. She could smell something hot, not quite burning, but the smell that comes just before burning, the kind of smell that means hurry. Outside, she could hear the city. Cars had stopped. She could see headlights through a fractured windshield, a blur of brightness from every direction. She could hear voices, the low murmur of people gathering, but it was a murmur of an audience, not of people deciding what to do. She heard someone say, "Oh my God," twice. She heard the distinct click and beep of a phone camera shutter. She saw, through the cracked glass, the glow of screens being raised. Nobody came. She tried the door again. Nothing. She tried to push it with her shoulder, and her wrist gave out completely, the pain shooting up her arm in a way that made her vision blur at the edges. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose and tried again. The door gave about an inch and stopped. She thought about her father. She thought about how he would handle this, who he would call, what he would say. She thought about the gala she had just left. All those careful people with their careful smiles. None of them were here. The crowd outside was growing, and still no one was moving toward her. Then the door moved. Not her doing it. Someone outside was pulling. She heard the metal groan, the sound of something being forced against its own resistance. She heard a grunt of effort. Then the door came open in a sharp, sudden give that sent a burst of cold night air into the car, and the smell of rain replaced the smell of heat, and a man's face appeared in the open door. He was tall and broad-shouldered, maybe late 30s, with dark hair that was wet from the rain. He wasn't dressed for a rescue. He had on dark jeans and work boots and a jacket that had probably been navy blue once, but had faded to a dull gray at the elbows and cuffs. There was a grease mark on his left forearm that hadn't fully washed out. His hands, gripping the door frame, were the hands of someone who worked with him, knuckles a little thick, a small scar across the back of the right one. He wasn't looking at her like she was Sandra Martin. He wasn't looking at her like she was a story. He was looking at her the way you look at a person when you're trying to figure out how badly they're hurt. "Can you move?" he said. His voice was even, not panicked. "My wrist," she said. "Can you move your legs?" She checked. "Yes." "Okay." He reached in and got his arm behind her back. "We need to go. The engine's too hot. Can you push with your legs if I pull?" She nodded. She pushed. He pulled. It wasn't graceful. Her gown tore somewhere on the door frame, and she scraped her knee on the center console, and her wrist screamed the whole way. But in about 15 seconds, she was out of the car and standing on wet pavement in the rain, her heels sinking slightly into a crack in the curb. The man kept hold of her until she had her footing. Then he moved her another 10 feet from the car, and she realized why when she heard the soft whump from under the hood. Not an explosion, just the sound of something igniting, and a thin line of smoke began rising from the front of the BMW. She turned to look at him. He was scanning her, making the same visual check she'd seen paramedics make. Eyes, movement, color. "Are you dizzy?" he said. "A little. Don't sit down yet. Keep standing. Do you have your phone?" She reached for it. It was in the small evening bag that had somehow stayed on her shoulder through all of it. Miracle of a good clasp. "Call," he said, and she understood he meant 911. She was already dialing. She could hear sirens in the distance, which meant someone in the crowd had already called. The crowd was still there, phone still up. Someone recognized her. She could tell by the way the murmuring changed, the way it shifted from shock to something more interested. She heard her own name. She turned to say something to man in the faded jacket. He was gone. She looked around. The crowd had thickened, but he wasn't in it. She looked toward the sidewalk. Both directions. Rain. Street lights. The backs of people already turning to get a better angle with their cameras. He wasn't there. He had simply stepped away, and the city had closed around him like water filling a space. The first police car arrived 90 seconds later. Then an ambulance. A young officer came to her, and she let him guide her to the side of the ambulance, and she answered his questions. Where she'd come from, what direction the other vehicle had come from, whether she'd gotten plate number. And the whole time she was answering, she kept looking past him, toward the sidewalk, toward the edge of the crowd. No one in the crowd had helped her. The man who had helped her was not in the crowd. She was treated for a mild concussion and a sprained wrist. The BMW was totaled. The driver of the other vehicle was found 3 blocks away with a dented fender and a license plate that came back to a name she didn't recognize. A 22-year-old who had run because he was scared, not because he was malicious, which almost made it worse. Sandra was discharged from the hospital at 4 a.m. Her father's driver picked her up. Her father himself called while she was in the back seat, already dressed the day in that way he had, like he never quite slept. "I heard," he said. "I'm fine," she said. "The press is going to pick it up by morning." "I know. I'll have Marcus handle it. We can make a story about the car safety features, or the first responders. Something clean." Sandra watched the city go past the window. The rain had eased to a drizzle. The streets were empty in the way they only get in the last hour before dawn, when the night people had gone home and the day people haven't started yet. "There was a man," she said. "What?" "A man pulled me out of the car before the ambulance got there. He was gone before I could. I didn't get his name. I didn't get to say anything to him." There was a pause. Her father's pauses always meant he was recalculating. "I'm sure the police can track him down if you want to make a statement," he said. "I don't mean for a statement," Sandra said. "I just mean I need to find him." Her father said something about getting sleep, and they'd talk in the morning. And Sandra said yes and goodbye and looked back out the window. Somewhere in that city, a man in a faded jacket was walking home in the rain and had no idea that he was the only real thing that had happened to her in years. Sandra spent 2 days in her apartment doing what she always did after something went wrong, which was nothing visible. She took her pain medication and iced her wrist and answered emails and had 3 video calls with Marcus, her father's head of PR, who had indeed made the accident into a story about first responders and urban infrastructure. She was not mentioned by name in the first news cycle, By the second day, it had moved down the page entirely. But something in her had shifted, and she couldn't find the position it had shifted from. She kept thinking about the moment the door came open. Not the relief of it, though there had been relief, but the fact of it. The fact that out of all the people standing there with their phones up and their voices low and their feet planted firmly on the ground, one man had simply walked forward. She kept trying to understand the decision. Had he waited? Had it been fast or slow? Had he known it might catch fire and come anyway? Or had he not thought about that yet? On the third day, she went back to the intersection. This was not a logical thing to do. The car had been towed. The scene had been cleared. There was nothing left except a scrape of paint on the signpost and some glitter of safety glass along the gutter that the rain hadn't fully washed away. Sandra stood on the curb in jeans and a coat, no jewelry, no driver, and looked at the spot where her car had been. She almost didn't see the drawing. It had been pressed flat against the base of the signpost, half tucked under the metal pole as if it slid there from a pocket and gotten caught. The rain had dampened it but not destroyed it. It was on cheap paper, the kind that comes in bulk packs, drawn in crayon with the confident inaccuracy of a young child. It showed a figure in a green cape. The figure was flying. Underneath, in uneven block letters that had the spelling of a 6-year-old, it said, "Dad is a hero." Sandra stood in the November cold and held the drawing in her good hand and felt something move through her chest that wasn't anything she had a prepared name for. She took the drawing home. She put it on her kitchen counter, which was an island of white marble, where she usually put nothing except a bowl of fruit she refreshed every 3 days, whether she'd eaten any of it or not. The drawing looked wrong there, and also right. She called her friend Delia that night. Delia was a journalist, the real kind, not the kind who covered galas, and she had a way of finding things out that Sandra had always admired from a comfortable distance. "I need to find someone," Sandra said. "What kind of someone?" "A man." He was at the intersection at Meridian and 6th on Thursday night around midnight. He pulled me out of the car. He had a child, or at least he was carrying something a child had drawn. He left before the police arrived. "Sandra," Delia said carefully, "I know how it sounds. It sounds like you want to find a man who actively didn't want to be found." "I know," Sandra said. "I still need to find him." Delia was quiet for a moment. "I can make some calls. The neighborhood has some corner cameras that aren't city-operated. Some of the storefronts. If you pass any of them." "Yes, please." It took 4 days. Delia called on a Wednesday morning and gave Sandra an address on the south side of the city, a part of town Sandra had driven through but never stopped in. The building was a 6-story walk-up with a buzzer panel that had half its labels missing. The name on the one Delia had identified was M. Johnson, Apartment 4C. Sandra stood outside the building for longer than she would admit. She had come alone. She had not told her father. She had not told Marcus. She was wearing the most ordinary clothes she owned, dark coat, dark pants, hair pulled back, and she still felt like she was dressed wrong for this street, this block, this particular Tuesday afternoon. She pressed a buzzer. Nothing for a while. Then the crackle of an intercom. "Yeah." A man's voice. Low, a little tired. She stopped. She hadn't planned what to say. "I'm looking for Matthew Johnson." Another pause. "Who is this?" "My name is Sandra. I was in a car accident last Thursday at Meridian and 6. You helped me." The intercom went quiet. She could hear, faintly, something that might have been a television. Then he said, "Hold on." He came down himself, which she hadn't expected. She'd expected the intercom again, or possibly nothing. But instead the front door opened and he was standing there. In the daylight, he looked more ordinary than memory had made him. Average height. Actually, she'd remembered him as taller. The jacket he had on now was different, a dark green fleece, and he was holding a cup of coffee in a mug that said "World's Okayest Dad" on the side. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You found me," he said, not accusing, just noting a fact. "You left," she said, before I could say anything. "I know." He leaned against the door frame. He didn't look nervous exactly, but he looked like a man who was being careful. "I wasn't really looking for a conversation." "I know that too," she said. "I just needed to say thank you." in person, not through a PR team. Something in his face shifted slightly at that. PR team? My father wanted to make a story. I told him not to. I'm here on my own. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her, not skeptically but assessingly, the same way he'd looked at her through the broken car window, checking for damage. You want coffee? He said finally. His apartment was on the 4th floor, and the elevator was out, which he apologized for, without seeming particularly embarrassed by it. The stairwell had a crack in the plaster on the 3rd landing that someone had patched with spackling and then apparently forgotten sand. The hallway smelled like someone on the 2nd floor was cooking something with garlic. The apartment was small and clean. That was the first thing she noticed. It was clean in a particular way. The way things are when someone keeps them clean deliberately, when tidiness is a matter of intention rather than an abundance of space. The couch was worn, but the cushions were straight. There were drawings pinned to the wall beside the kitchen, dozens of them, some clearly old, some fresh. A small pair of sneakers was lined up by the door with the precision of a child who had been told many times exactly where to put them. Matthew Johnson poured her coffee from a pot that had been on for a while. He didn't apologize for it. She didn't mention it. They sat at a small kitchen table, and she said thank you again, properly this time, and he listened to it without deflecting it away, which was a correct thing to do, she realized. He just nodded and said he was glad she was okay. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. Everyone else just stood there. You know that, right? There were probably 40 people who could see what was happening, and no one moved. I know, he said. He wrapped both hands around his mug. I see a lot at night. People freeze. It's not bad, exactly. It's just, the brain takes a second to decide if it's real. Your brain didn't take a second. He was quiet for a moment. I used to work nights in a shipping warehouse where we had a pretty bad accident a few years back. Guy got caught in a conveyor. Everyone froze. I didn't, and after that I guess the habit stuck. Sandra looked at him. He wasn't telling her this like it was a heroic story. He was telling it like it was a useful piece of information, like an explanation for a mechanical part. I found a drawing, she said. She opened her coat pocket and took out the crayon figure. She had put it in a plastic sleeve to protect it. At the scene, I think it fell out of your pocket. He looked at the drawing. Something happened in his face that was private and brief and not for her. Then he took it from her carefully. My son made that, he said. He makes them every week. He's been going through a superhero phase. How old is he? 6. Almost 7. He drew you in a green cape. Matthew looked at the drawing again. The corner of his mouth moved. I have a green jacket, he said. Winter coat. He's very literal. Sandra laughed. It came out before she thought to manage it. A real laugh, sudden and unpracticed. Matthew looked up at the sound of it, like he was surprised by it too. She stayed for 40 minutes. She didn't mean to stay that long. They talked about the accident a little more, and then somehow about the neighborhood, about a diner on the corner that he said had been there since before he was born and served the same menu it had always served because the owner, a 70-year-old named Frank, considered changing the menu a form of moral failure. She laughed again at that. He smiled, which was different from his usual expression in a way she found herself noticing. When she stood to leave, she said, I'd like to return the favor sometime. I know that's something people say. I mean it specifically. You don't owe me anything, he said. I know I don't, she said. That's not why I'm saying it. He walked her to the door. She walked down 4 flights of stairs and out into the cold air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment before she found a cab. She rode home through afternoon traffic and looked out the window and thought about the way his face had looked at the drawing, that private, brief something, and the way he'd said the word my son, like they were the most load-bearing words in his vocabulary. Listen, if you're still here, it means you're invested. You want to see what happens next. But here's the reality. Most people watch stories like this and scroll away without subscribing. They enjoy it, then vanish. If this story actually matters to you, if you genuinely care about how it ends, hit that subscribe button. It only takes a second. Otherwise, you'll probably forget this channel exists and miss all the other incredible stories I share. The story broke on a Saturday. Sandra heard about it from Marcus at 7 in the morning. A phone call that woke her out of the first real sleep she'd had in a week. He was using his controlled voice, which was a voice he used when things were not controlled. "There's a piece running in the Metro Digest," he said. "They're calling him the Ghost Savior. They have his name." Sandra sat up. "How?" "Your father's security team was doing background research, routine for anyone who had contact with you. Someone talked to the wrong person. I don't know who yet. Matthew Johnson didn't want to be found," Sandra said. Her voice was very flat. "I know. He helped me, and then he walked away because he didn't want." She stopped. "Where does the story say he lives?" "It doesn't have an address, but it has his name and his employer, and the fact that he has a son." "That's enough," Sandra said. "That's more than enough for people to find him." The Metro Digest piece had a comment section with 400 responses by 9 a.m. Most of them were positive in the way online positivity often is, loud and impersonal. The enthusiasm of people who wanted to feel part of something. By noon, someone had identified the school his son attended based on a detail, an article about the neighborhood. By 1 p.m., there were 2 vans from different local news stations parked outside the school. Sandra knew this because she went there. She didn't call Matthew first because she didn't have his number, and she didn't want to waste the time it would take to try to reach him through the intercom and the 4th floor walk-up. She told her driver to take her directly to the school, and she sat in the back of the car on the way there calling every media contact she had, starting with the ones who owed her the most. The school was a public elementary, brick, 2 stories, with a chain-link fence along the front and a mural on the side wall that the 3rd graders had painted. The 2 news vans were on the street outside the fence. A producer Sandra recognized from a local morning show was standing on the sidewalk talking into a phone. There were about 6 people with cameras. Sandra got out of the car. The producer saw her first. Sandra could see the calculation happen in real time. The pause, the redirect, the move toward her. "Ms. Martin, you're outside of primary school," Sandra said. She said it evenly, conversationally, the way her father had taught her to deliver the lines that were meant to land. "There are 6-year-olds inside. Whatever story you think you have here, you don't have it. We're on public property. You're on public property outside a primary school with cameras pointed at a building that contains children. I have a call into the city desk editor at the Chronicle, the legal team at the Broadcast Standards Board, and my father's attorney, who genuinely enjoys this kind of situation." She paused. "You want to talk about the Ghost Savior? I'll give you a statement. A real one. You leave this school off the story entirely." The producer was quiet. Sandra could feel the others listening. "What kind of statement?" The producer said. "The kind that makes the story bigger and doesn't involve children," Sandra said. "Give me an hour." She called Marcus from the car. He was unhappy, then practical, which was his natural sequence. They put together a statement that was genuine. That much she insisted on, and specific enough to redirect the story's energy towards Sandra herself, toward her foundation's new initiative for night shift worker safety, which had not existed 2 hours ago, but existed now, at least on paper. By 3 p.m., the vans had moved from outside the school. She texted the address to Delia, who knew the building, and asked her to get a message to Matthew that evening. He called her that night. She had obtained his number through Delia. "The vans are gone," he said. "Yes. Charlie's teacher called me. She said there was some media thing this morning, and it had calmed down." "Yes." There was a pause. She could hear the radiator in the background, a knocking, clanking sound that was exactly the sound of old building infrastructure complaining about the temperature. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Actually," Sandra said, "I did. My father's team is the reason it happened, which makes it your responsibility." He didn't say it to argue. He seemed genuinely curious about whether she believed that. "Yes," she said, "my responsibility." Another pause. The radiator knocked twice. "How's Charlie?" she said. "He doesn't know any of it. He thinks I just want to work, which I did before any of this." He paused again. He made another drawing this week. "I'm a whale now." "A whale?" "Apparently superheroes are last week." He saw a documentary about humpbacks. Sandra smiled at the ceiling of her apartment. Tell him the whale is a good choice. I'll tell him a woman he doesn't know endorses his artistic decisions. That'll definitely mean a lot to him. She heard him almost laugh. It was a sound like something starting and then being thought better of, but it was there. Thank you, he said, for going to the school, for the statement. You didn't have to make it public. It needed to be public, she said. That's the only language the story understands. He was quiet. She could tell he was thinking about something. Outside her window, 30 floors up, the city moved in its nighttime patterns. The lights of the bridge, the line of taillights on the expressway, the way the sky above the financial district never quite got dark. The initiative you mentioned, he said, the night shift safety thing. Is that real? She looked at the ceiling again. It is now, she said. What does that mean? It means I said it in a statement, so it needs to become real. And also I think it should be real. There are, she stopped. She was about to say there are a lot of people who work the shift you work, which was true, but was also the kind of thing that sounded like she was talking about an abstraction. There are a lot of people who come home late and walk in the dark and help strangers, and nobody thinks about what happens to them. Matthew was quiet for a moment. That's a generous thing, he said slowly, to build a whole initiative around one man who pulled a door open. It's not about you, Sandra said. Then she thought about it. Well, it started with you, but it's not only about you. That's probably the right way to do it, he said. They talked for another 20 minutes about nothing in particular. The radiator, the whale drawing, the diner on his corner, where Frank had apparently refused to add a single vegetarian option despite repeated requests from a new apartments going up 2 blocks north. She laughed again. He almost laughed again. When she hung up, her apartment was quiet in a particular way it had always been quiet. Climate-controlled and insulated and 30 floors above the noise. The kind of quiet that is not peace, but simply the absence of disturbance. She sat with it for a while. Then she opened her laptop and started writing notes for what a night shift safety initiative might actually look like. It took her until midnight to fill the first page. She went to bed feeling something she didn't immediately have a word for. It felt like the opposite of empty, but not full exactly. It felt like the beginning of something that might eventually be full if she kept at it. She thought that was probably enough to go on. February came in cold and stayed that way. Sandra had been to the south side of the city 4 times since November. She had started the foundation work in January, incorporated it properly with Marcus's reluctant help, and hired 2 people who actually knew what they were talking about, a woman named Rosa, who had spent 12 years working with labor advocacy organizations, and a younger man named Terrence who had grown up in a family of night shift nurses and knew the data like it was personal, which it was. The initiative was called Meridian. She'd named it after the intersection and not told anyone why. Her father knew something was happening. He always knew when something was happening with Sandra, not the details, but the temperature of her, which had changed. He had invited her to lunch twice in January, and she had gone both times, which was 2 more times than she'd usually gone in a month, and he had watched her across the table with the look he had when he was deciding whether to ask directly or wait. He waited. On the first Saturday of February, Sandra took a cab to the south side instead of her driver, which she had started doing when she went to that part of the city. It wasn't a performance. It was just that the driver made her feel like a visitor, and she was trying to stop feeling like a visitor. She walked 2 blocks to the small park on Clement Street that Matthew had mentioned once. He took Charlie there on weekends when the weather allowed, which in Chicago in February was a relative term, but Charlie, according to his father, had a 6-year-old's immunity to cold. The park was not impressive. It was the kind of park that exists in every working neighborhood, a rectangle of frozen ground with a swing set and 2 benches, and a single large oak that had probably been there before any of the surrounding buildings. The benches had a thin crust of snow along their backs from the previous night. The swings were empty. Sandra sat down on one of the benches and waited. She was not sure he would come. She had told him, in a text the day before, that she would be at the Clement Street Park in the morning if he happened to be around with the whale artist. She had not asked him to be there. She had not told him why. She was aware that this was an odd thing to do, and she had done it anyway because she was finding lately that the correct move and the honest move were not always the same thing, and she was trying to favor the honest one more often. She had been on the bench for about 10 minutes when she heard them. Charlie's voice first, high and fast, the way children talk when they've been holding a thought for the whole walk, and finally had permission to release it. She couldn't make out the words. Then Matthew's voice lower, one patient question, which quieted Charlie for about 4 seconds before the talking started again. They came around the corner of the park's small entrance. Charlie in a red coat 2 sizes too large for him because Matthew had explained once. He bought coats for children to grow into and not for the current year. The coat had Velcro closures and a hood with a fur trim that Charlie had pulled up over his head despite the fact that there was no active precipitation. He was wearing mittens on a cord. He was eating something, crackers probably, out of a small bag he held in one mittened hand. Matthew saw her first. He lifted one hand in a greeting that was understated by design. She'd learned. He didn't perform warmth in public. He just let it exist quietly, and you either saw it or you didn't. Charlie saw her a second later and stopped walking entirely, which was apparently just something he did when he encountered something new. He stood with his crackers and stared. "Charlie," Matthew said, "this is Sandra." "Hi," Charlie said. He studied her. He had his father's directness without his father's patience, which was going to be an interesting combination in about 10 years. "Do you live around here?" "Not exactly," Sandra said. "Where do you live?" "On the other side of the city." Charlie considered this. "Why are you here then?" "To sit in the park," she said. He looked at the park, as if verifying it was worthy of that trip. Then he looked back at her. "Okay," he said, which apparently meant the cross-examination was over. And he turned to the swing set. Matthew sat on the other bench. He had a cup of coffee in a paper cup, the diner kind, which meant he'd come past Frank's on the way. She noticed he brought one for her, which he placed on the bench between them without making a thing of it. "He adjusts fast," Sandra said. "He's 6, Matthew said. "Everyone is a potential new thing. That's the whole project at this age." They watched Charlie attack the swings with the focused energy of someone who had a limited window. He pumped his legs and got the swing going, and then let himself drag to a stop and started over, testing something about the mechanics of it that only he understood. "The initiative is moving," Sanders said. "We got the first city contract last week. It's small night route lighting assessment on 3 corridors, but it's a start." "That's real," Matthew said. He sounded like he meant it. "That's something actual people will feel." That's what Rosa said. "She's better at describing it than I am." "You'll get better." Sandra looked at the side of his face. He was watching Charlie. "You think so?" "You're already better than you were in November." He glanced at her. "Don't take that wrong. In November you were fine. You talk about things like they were further away than they were. You don't do that as much anymore." She thought about that. It was an accurate observation delivered without decoration, and she was getting used to the fact that this was how he communicated, not unkind, but not cushioned either. "My father wants to meet you," she said. Matthew was quiet for a moment. "Does he?" "He knows something changed for me. He doesn't know the whole of it, but he knows you're part of it. He'll keep asking until something happens. And you want to know if I'm willing. I want to know how you feel about it." He looked at Charlie again, who had abandoned the swings for the oak tree and was examining its bark with the dedication of a geologist. "I'll meet him," Matthew said, "not as a thank you for the foundation, not as," he paused, choosing word with care, "not as the go savior guy, just as someone you know." "That's all I want," Sanders said. "That's the only way I'd want it to happen." He nodded once. She believed him. He believed her. These were the small economies they had built between themselves over 3 months, and they were more load-bearing than they looked. Charlie was back. He had a piece of bark in his mittened hand and was presenting it to Matthew with the gravity of someone delivering important documents. "It's a fossil," Charlie said. Matthew examined it. "It looks like bark." "It's a fossil," Charlie said firmly. "Dinosaurs touched it." "Dinosaurs touched this specific piece of bark." "Yes." Charlie looked at Sandra. "Dinosaurs touched it, right?" Sandra took the bark and looked at it seriously. It was bark. It was also, in the way that Charlie needed it to be, something more. "I think you're probably right," she said. Charlie accepted this, retrieved his fossil, and went back to the tree. Matthew caught Sandra's eye, and she could see the thing in his face that she had first seen when she returned the drawing. Private and warm and briefly visible, like light through a crack. She picked up the coffee he had brought her. It was still warm. They sat on the bench in the cold February light, and Charlie talked to the oak tree about its dinosaur history, and the city moved around the edges of the park in its ordinary way. A bus turning on Clement, someone walking a dog, a grocery cart left near the entrance, and Sandra thought about what Matthew had said in November, that night in his apartment, about how his job was to make the world feel completely safe for his son. She thought about how much of her adult life she had spent in rooms where safety was purchased and arranged and maintained by other people, and how that was different from this, from a park bench and a paper cup and a child's theory about fossils. She could not have this life. That was not the point. Her life was in the glass tower and the foundation offices and the endless logistics of having a name that meant something to people who had never met her. She was not going to disappear into this street, this neighborhood, this small rectangle of frozen park. But she could come here. She could walk instead of being driven. She could sit on a bench with cold coffee and listen to a child explain the prehistoric significance of ordinary things. She could do the work of the foundation not as a branding exercise, but as an actual thing, with actual consequences, that people who worked at midnight and walk home alone might one day feel in the quality of their street. She could be the kind of person, she thought, who showed up, not for credit, not for the story, just because a man in a faded jacket had shown her, on a rain-slicked November street, that showing up was what you did when it mattered, and that when you did it right, you could walk away with nothing and leave everything behind. Do you always come here on Saturdays? She asked. Most of them, Matthew said. Would it be all right? Sandra said carefully. If I sometimes came too? He looked at her, not at the heiress, not at the foundation, not at the woman who'd stood outside a school and redirected 2 news vans with a phone call, just at her, in the way he'd looked at her through the broken car window in November, straightforward, assessing present. Yeah, he said, that'd be all right. Charlie came back with a second piece of bark. This one's a bigger fossil, he said. This one's for you. He held out to Sandra. She took it with both hands. Thank you, she said. Charlie was already moving again, already on to the next thing, the way children do when the giving is done and the world calls them forward. Matthew watched him with the steady, quiet attention of a man whose whole internal life had reorganized around a single small person, and Sandra held a piece of bark in her hands and felt, for maybe the first time, like she was somewhere she had chosen to be. Not because it was expected of her, not because it was photographable, not because it served a purpose beyond itself. Just because it was Thursday, and she was here, and she knew now what her days were going to look like. That was enough. That was more than enough. The greatest rescues in life rarely come from the people with the most power, the most money, or the most followers. They come from the person who simply decides to move when everyone else is frozen. Matthew Johnson had nothing the world considers impressive. No title, no wealth, no audience. But he had the one thing that actually matters in a moment of crisis, which is a willingness to step forward without calculating what he would get in return. And Sandra's real transformation wasn't surviving the crash. It was learning that a life spent being looked at is not the same as a life spent showing up, and that the most meaningful thing she would ever do would be done quietly, for people the world tends to walk past. The lesson is simple but easy to forget. Courage is not loud. Generosity does not announce itself. And the most important question you'll ever answer is not, what will people think of me, but will I move or will I stand here holding my phone? Before you go, let me ask you something, if the story kept you listening until now, why not subscribe? A lot of people watch. A lot of people enjoy. But most never click that button. Don't just be a viewer. Be part of this, like the video if it hit. Share it with someone who'd love it. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next. And drop a comment telling me your favorite part of the story. I really want to know what stood out to you, though, and be honest. Do you want part 2?